All right, we are going to start our recording and start our agenda for this evening. If you are just getting connected, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We love having that chat record to go back and look to see who is here. It also helps us because we do have a free bonus for all of you who are attending live tonight that you will receive via email tomorrow. So it helps us to also see who you are. If your Zoom identification there doesn't have your full name, if you could make sure that you drop that in the chat so I can find it in one place or the other. I learned this last month that I had a lot of first names and it was a little hard matching who you are to where I can send your bonus gift to. So make sure your full name is either in the chat or in your identifier on Zoom so that we can match you up with your email address. All right, thank you so much for joining tonight. We're here to talk about literacy development for English learners, multilingual students, and we'll touch on a couple different topics, the things that have come out in research recently, things to think about as we're getting this year going, starting to know who our students are, getting a good idea of who we have in our classrooms. So let's get into some things to think about and consider as you continue to develop your programs and your classroom planning. Thank you so much for introducing everyone. I love the different roles that are here, the different states that are covered. I think we're covering a good part of the country here tonight. So as I said, I'm Kelly Ryder. I'm the founder of English Learner Portal. And I have put just a few bullets here. I think I am like most educators who have been in the systems for a while, where I've had many different roles from the early 90s up and through 2018 when I left the public school system to start English Learner Portal. So during that time, I got to see education from the role of the ESL or English Language Development teacher, from the classroom teacher, and the school administrator and district administrator, and also as a WIDA consortium traveling trainer consultant as well. So I think that really helps to see what's going on and understand all of your different roles, because you are coming from all those different types of positions as well. So in 2018, we started English Learner Portal to just try to keep people informed, to do professional learning, to offer support to those who are interested in the education of students learning English as a second language. And tonight we're going to get into the idea of literacy development and touch a little bit on the idea of when students are falling behind, like what's going on when you feel like students are falling behind. All right, here are some of what we are going to touch on this evening. I will let you look that over. And if there's anything that you came here thinking, oh, I really hope that she touches on this or mentions this, feel free to put that in the chat box. And if time allows, we can try to get to other topics or work those requests in as much as possible. So as I said, we're going to look at a couple pieces of recent research or summaries of that research, not get into the nitty-gritty details, but the summaries of recent research that have really stood out to me in the past year or so as we're trying to wrap our heads around, as it says here, the science of reading and how the science of reading and second language acquisition, second language literacy come together. Um, that has been science of reading has been a hot topic for a couple of years now. And so our research and our conversations when it comes to our multilingual students are just starting to, I won't even say catch up, but just starting to get going, right, of how all of this applies to our multilingual students. And then we'll talk about additional considerations in addition to what we've been hearing about from science of reading that we need to think about with our multilingual students, and then just think about some other ways to look at things, some things to brainstorm on, to ponder, to think about how our programs are put together and are we maximizing the time that we have with students. All right, here are the top 3 things that I've been looking at in the last couple months. So if you are into reading articles, reading research, looking into what's going on, here are 3 of the resources that I used for our information to share tonight. To the left of the screen is Dr. Samuel Ortiz. I became introduced to Dr. Samuel Ortiz in working with a grant related to the reducing the over-identification of multilingual students in special education. And he's been doing a lot of work around the idea. He comes from it from the psychological, psychometric side of testing students. And how do we know when students may have disabilities and when it's language? He's been doing a lot of work in that area. So I highly recommend Google Dr. Samuel Ortiz, and he's got videos on YouTube. He's really great at explaining what's happening with students as they enter the classroom, and gives a lot of examples from his own personal experience being an English as a second language learner in his early years coming into school. We'll also pull a couple ideas from WIDA's response to intervention 2. We are always looking to what experts are saying out there that are really looking at programs, looking at our standards, looking at what's going on. Question comes up all the time about when do our multilingual students need intervention? When do we go there? How much time do we give? What type of intervention? So I always recommend WIDA's response to intervention materials have great things to consider as well. And then when it comes to the combination of science of reading practices with a focus on how that works and impacts with language development, second language development, and multilingual learners. One of my favorite resources is from the great schools here, the Framework for Foundational Literacy Skills. Instruction for English learners really compares what science of reading is saying, what matches the research that has been done for multilingual learners, and then other things that you should consider that we know about language development that may not have been discussed on a large scale in the rollout with science of reading. Now we know that there isn't a lot of research around literacy development in the second language. Unfortunately, there's just not nearly as much research on this population as there is on native English speaking peers. So the recommendations, of course, are mostly based on native English speakers. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. The good news is they're not wildly different, right? Just some little nuances and tweaks and things to think about that we can add in there. So you can breathe to think, oh no, please don't tell us that, throw out science of reading. That's not where we're going tonight. Good news is what everybody's been talking about is headed well in the right direction. All right, so this graphic takes a little bit of explanation. This is from a presentation that I attended from Dr. Samuel Ortiz. Give him full credit to look him up. And he explained it in a way that just really made sense. So we know about the gap in language development between our native English speakers and our English as a second language or third, fourth, fifth, our multilingual students. There's clearly a gap. And so what this chart is showing, if you look at the dotted red line, the dotted red line is a native English speaker. So we have here that at birth, the native English speaker is exposed to how many hours of English a day, right? And so the red line goes, of course, as the child gets older, there are more hours of the day. So they're exposed to more language a day. And that by the time a native English speaker reaches kindergarten age, about age 5, they have been exposed to 21,900 hours of English on average, right? Thinking about how much time children are usually awake at each age and doing a lot's calculations. And then we look at our blue line, which is our multilingual group. And our multilingual group, where if we're saying have their first exposure to English when they enter school in kindergarten at 5 years old, that's when their clock starts ticking of how many hours of exposure to English. And so Dr. Ortiz did a good amount of research and calculations around, not assuming that there's a lot of English spoken at home, but not assuming there's no English spoken at home. So adding about 2 hours a day of English exposure after school to account for, television and social media, playing with friends, family members, things like that, and calculated how many hours of exposure to English our multilingual learners have. So, of course, it's no surprise that by the time our students are kindergarten age, that our native English speakers have a huge head start in developing their English language proficiency, of course. So then we talk about the concept of catching up, right? How do you close that gap? Well, how do you close that gap when your native English speakers continue to be exposed to just as much, if not more, English every day as your multilingual students? So closing that gap of time is extremely difficult, if not impossible. So then what he was looking at is the idea of when our school expectations for CALP, cognitive, academic, language proficiency, our Jim Cummins research. So when do we expect students to start getting a true grasp of academic language, right? We're starting academic language at the very beginning of school, right? We're good about, we do vocabulary, we're talking about things, even in kindergarten, we're talking about math, we're talking about science. But we often see that divide happen around 4th to 5th grade, where our students who are learning English hit a plateau, right? A lot of our students will exit programs by third grade, and then others will continue on, but we really see a plateau about that fourth grade level. And that, not by coincidence, is when the expectations for a lot more use of academic language are kicking in our curriculum and in the work that students do every day. They're now expected to read for information, right? They're reading to learn instead of learning to read. Um, our multilingual students with 24,000 less hours of exposure to English are trying to tackle that same academic language. If you just think about it as like pouring into, I think of it like pouring your water into the jug, and how can you function at the same level with half as much input? And so it makes sense that around that age, we really start to feel the crunch of those hours of exposure are starting to really show how it impacts what is happening with students, because that's when the expectations really jump for using language to learn, right? So what we need to talk about tonight and think about tonight is we can't add more hours of the day. We can't force families to speak English 24 hours a day. That's not going to work very well. So what can we do to help move our multilingual students to kind of change their trajectory some? So their angle of improvement isn't just based on hours, but is based on that we have a lot more control over what is happening during the school day to help students start closing in on that CALP, on that academic language proficiency sooner than later. Right? We have to play catch up, of course. All right, so here's a quote that Dr. Ortiz shared in a presentation I attended recently, and it really stood out to me. So I'll give you a moment to look it over. When we talk about closing the gap, right, what we're saying is to close that, we would need our multilingual students to learn 1.5 times faster for 6 years straight, right? And that's considering that they're doing, probably 2 to 3 times more processing already by working in 2 different languages. Sorry, there's this little bug flying around. I look like I'm waving crazy. Um, and so it's not realistic, right? So what can we do? Because we can't find 1.5 times more time with our students. But what we can do is find those hours in our school day where we are not necessarily making the most of what could be language development time and cognitive language development time. This is another bit of his research that he shared, which I found to at first to be a little depressing, but realistic and honest. And I think it was a good wake-up call for me to say, okay, if this is what the research is saying, then what can we do to change the trajectory of some of these lines? So our general pattern of student achievement on standardized tests in English. Right, so across the bottom, your grade level, and these are all your multilingual learners, and based on the type of English language development program they are in, how they were scoring on standardized tests in English. So your state assessments, things like that. And this research came to show that two-way bilingual held the top most consistent growth across the school career of students, with late exit bilingual to content ESL coming in right under that. And then while all the different types of programs kind of, held together pretty well till about fourth grade, then we started to see things changing. Then our early exit bilingual programs. So two-way bilingual is having students in both native language and in English for their school career. Late exit bilingual, they're leaving middle school ages around sixth grade from the bilingual program. And then early exit bilingual programs, they're leaving in late elementary school. And then we have our content-based ESL and ESL pull-out traditional that are really falling off in that effectiveness as the grades go up. So I can tell you my first reaction was like that is really depressing. And why? Because I think we do a pretty good job, right? I think we're working hard, we're learning a lot, we're doing all this. And what else was a little depressing to me is that I know that a majority of all of the school districts where I worked, except for maybe a couple schools that had some kind of bilingual program, for the most part, had no kind of bilingual program offered. And the majority of schools that I've worked with through WIDA or English Learner Portal have not had any type of bilingual program. So majority of our schools out there are in that red box of either content-based ESL or traditional pullout. And so it really got me thinking of what can we do to change this trajectory? Because you see the same phenomenon happen if you noticed it. Right around fourth grade, the curve starts to change, right? So our bilingual programs, if you are part of them, then the better you make your program, the better your curve will, the longer your curve will stay high. For those of us working in non-bilingual programs, it looks like around fourth grade, fifth grade, the effectiveness starts to go down a little bit. And so I'd love in the chat box if you have any theories on that or your thoughts on why that would be. Why are our content-based ESL or our ESL pull-out, traditional kind of pull-out programs, why do we see a declining return on investment around that fourth and fifth grade level, around the same time where the that CALP line happens, right around when the demand for CALP goes up, our trajectory comes down a bit. All right, so feel free to put your thoughts in the chat, or if how I'm explaining it needs a better explanation, then feel free to put that too, and I can try to word it differently. But that's what jumped out at me right away was the kind of programs we have in most places are losing effectiveness around fourth, fifth, sixth grade, right around when the demands for CALP are hitting. The idea of COVID, these are long-term studies, and so that would be a good thing to go back and look at and see what the date range is of when this data was collected that could be a part of it. Hang on, thank you so much for sharing your ideas. I want to scroll through them really quickly and kind of get your thoughts. right, so we're really kind of trying, as I try to summarize the thoughts going into the chat box, I encourage you to check them out as well. There's some thoughts around getting access to the general education curriculum and pull out, and when the demand in general education curriculum really starts to go up around 4th and 5th grade, when that calc kicks in, that missing time from that maybe helps create a larger gap, right? You all are putting in like all the things that were rolling through my mind as you go through this. There are so many factors that can influence this, right? Because we know that every program doesn't follow this. And right, middle school identity crisis. Middle school students in general are middle school students, so that affects a lot of things. But there are all kinds of factors that come into play. So how do we even begin to address that widening gap, right? This conversation came up because of over-identifying students for special education. And we want to identify a student for special education when by 4th or 5th grade, they're not grasping everything that we want them to grasp. But we look at that graph and we see there's a lot of good reasons why that's happening, but we don't want to stand back and just accept it, even though we understand it, right? So you are listing a ton of the factors that come into play. So let's look at a few of them and see what things are in our control, what things are beyond our control, right? We can only work on the things that we can have an influence over. This slide and the next slide are from the Council of Great City Schools. They did a wonderful summary of the science of reading, the big ideas of science of reading, and then how that compares to research in second language literacy. So I'll give you a moment just to scan through that and get the big idea. Lots of great points in the chat. Thank you. Content-based ESL would be more like a push-in type program where you are giving the ESL instruction in the context of the content classroom. There's a lot of C's in there. All right, so what the comparison of research was finding, as we said, that 80% of the research out there on reading development, literacy development has been done on monolingual English speakers. So we have to understand that we need to open our minds to think what else comes into play when it comes to our multilingual students. I also highlighted that part there when ELL's literacy instruction focus primarily on developing bottom-up phonics and phonemic awareness. Students often develop the ability to word call, but with less comprehension. Some of you mentioned similar ideas in the chat box. And then also, of course, our students entering at different ages. Let's say that student doesn't start until 3rd grade, then their trajectory is going to have an even bigger gap, right? So all those things come into play. And we may look that reading may look different for ELLs than it does for monolingual English speaking students, right? And I don't mean totally and completely different. They're not saying totally and completely different, but there are differences that we really have to respect and honor if we are going to help students make progress and close those gaps. So here are some big ideas that I'm a huge believer in And when I read these things in the Council of Great City Schools, and I've heard it from WIDA Consortium, from Dr. Ortiz, more and more people are coming together and agreeing. My heart felt better, right? My heart felt happy that ELL's literacy instruction should begin with meaningful context connected to the curricular themes and big ideas. So there's a lot packed in that sentence. Meaningful context. We'll get to that in just a minute. By connecting to curricular themes and big ideas, we are getting to that CALP sooner. Right? We can't wait. Like the days of saying, first, we're going to work on BICS and we're going to really focus on social language. And that's going to be the first year or two. And then, once they have BICS down, the basic interpersonal communication skills or social language. Once they have that down, then we'll start getting into academic language. Well, it is my thought, my experience is that we don't have time to wait because we're supposed to be moving at 1.5 times faster, and waiting till 4 or 5 years into knowing English or 2 years into knowing English before we start really focusing on academic language is widening that gap. So the sooner we start the focus on academic language, the better. You can learn your basic communication skills, your social language, and academic language simultaneously. And I have had these discussions for years and years, and it became a real curriculum adoption or curriculum writing kind of battle in a couple districts where I worked of what a newcomer curriculum looks like. And so I can say, if most of you are on our email list, and that's probably how you found out about tonight, is that that we've been writing newcomer curriculum. And I felt validated in what we do when all the different pieces of research are coming together and saying, we've got to get into academic language sooner, right? So we need to start that right away. And we do that with a lot of scaffolding and support and being really strategic about how students use that language. Using situations, scenarios, context that is meaningful to students, right? Kind of keep that in your mind there. Next big piece. Teachers must work on the oral language students need in order to recognize and comprehend what they are reading. So boiled down, if I can speak it and understand it, I have a much better chance of being able to read it and write it. So what I see and what the researchers are seeing, so again, it feels good to have that affirmation, is that our students are exposed to all those hours of English, but not many of them are fully participating in 28,000 hours of English, right? Think about the difference if we could add a line to that chart to say passive exposure to English or active engagement in English. That piece is going to create a huge difference for your students. You have to use the language to learn the language. That was a saying that I heard somewhere in a conference years ago, and it just stuck in my mind. Like, yes, that makes total sense. We know that if you've taken foreign language classes, as a native English speaker, you have different experiences with how much you can actually speak the language when you come out of those classes. Oral language, yeah, you have to have time for this, right? And we have to have high expectations for even our newcomers, our beginners, that they can and will participate in the oral language activities and in academic language, because they can, if we set up the climate, the classroom climate, to be a safe place for them, and we scaffold with the different supports they need in place and provide modeling, then they can absolutely fully participate. The more you increase their full engagement, the more we're going to bring that bottom line in that chart up towards the top line. All right, so this is from the Response to Intervention book from WIDA, where they get into talking about just making some suggestions of what you should be looking at, what types of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 instruction to consider when you're talking about multilingual learners. The Response to Intervention 2 book is a free download from the WIDA website. If you go in their search resources, you can download the PDF, you can buy a print version. I don't work for WIDA anymore, but this book was very helpful for me in that it gave me a lot of things to consider and think about, but it also gave places for conversations to happen within schools. Right, so we had some information to sit down and look at and read together and say, what do you think about this? Right, we had higher level conversations about our interventions. So thinking about your tier 1, where are our opportunities to bring those lines up through paying attention to our tier 1 instruction? Right, that includes the classroom content area instruction and your ESL English language development instruction, right? 2 mandatory programs in the student's world, your regular classroom instruction and your English language development instruction. If we sacrifice one for another, then we're bringing the line back. Right? It's when we coordinate all services and everyone knows their place in the big picture, then we can bring that line back up. So the key piece that I've noticed in visiting schools and going into planning and into leadership meetings is knowing each other's role. Right? If we are all doing the same thing, then we're just like it's like taking if we have the Grand Canyon and we grab a rock and throw it in, and then someone goes to get that rock and gives it to me, and then I throw it in, and someone goes to get that rock and I give it to someone else and they throw it in. That's what we're doing when we have all of our teachers doing the same thing. So for example, if in the regular content instruction, the language arts curriculum, there's a focus on phonemic awareness, phonics, like putting words together, your typical early grade, early literacy kind of approach. We're not saying to change that, because we're saying in the language world, we agree with science of reading. There's just a few key pieces that we need to add on, right? That's that teacher's part of the job. So what we don't want to do, we flatline that growth. We're not growing at 1.5 times the speed of light here. If then the ESL teacher or ELD teacher, I know you're called all kinds of things, and I don't want to make it sound like I don't know who you are, but everywhere we have different names. But the English language development teachers are then taking the students and doing more of that work, then they're throwing the same rock into the Grand Canyon. And then maybe they're going to a reading intervention where they're doing more of the same kind of work. And then that teacher is throwing the same rock into the Grand Canyon. Right? So think about it in a way of your content teacher is teaching the way that their curriculum is written and is starting with the small pieces and building them up into bigger literacy, right? The ELD person, that English language development person, can support that, but what can they be doing to add to instead of doing more of the same? We don't need more of the same. We need in addition to, and that's what the extra research is saying. And then when it comes to, if there's a paraeducator or if there's an after-school program, what can we add to create like a big buffet of experiences and exposures for students rather than staying on the same skills, right? Students learn in different ways. So let's talk about what that could look like. Another article that I highly recommend, look up New America, 3 Ways to Ensure English Learners Benefit from Science of Reading. More reiteration of the same ideas of, yes, like we're all talking about the same things, but we don't all need to teach the exact same skills at the exact same time for it to happen, right? Nothing in Science of Reading says that everybody who works with a student teaches this skill first, right? There's a lot to Science of Reading. So let's figure out how we can pull the different pieces and have all of the adults involved contributing. And so this is a good article that kind of sums up the big differences. And the one thing I really loved that they had in the article was everybody's heard of the 5 pillars from Science of Reading. And no one in the English language development or second language research world have I heard disagree with those, right? Everybody's on the same page. You need phonological awareness. You need phonics, you need fluency, you need vocabulary, you need comprehension. Absolutely. Now, our classroom curriculum has us going about that a certain way, and we have groups of students who are not keeping pace with that, right? And this is telling us something. And so I loved how the authors of this article from New America were showing their agreement with what's going on with Science of Reading, but then adding the 2 pieces from second language acquisition research that are being often overlooked in implementation of reading programs: oral language development and the development of background knowledge, which in a roundabout way equals that CALP, right? Equals that academic language. Because our students who have been exposed to English for years and years have had, been to museums, been cooking with family, have been out and about or watching shows or watching movies. There's a lot of background knowledge in English, right? So our challenge is that the only way we can speed this up, if we do the same 5 green pillars and every adult is working on the same 5 green pillars, and we're not talking about the 2 red ones, then we're not closing those. We're not closing that gap. So where does oral language development and background knowledge fit? Right. When does other pieces of Science of Reading fit? And as Jillian is saying, like, what if you're in a place that is not like gone gung-ho Science of Reading? Because not everywhere has. Fontes and Pinnell is what I used as a teacher for many, many years. And I can tell you that at first, when Science of Reading came out, I had a little panic. I'm like, but we know, like, I taught kids who learned how to read for many years, especially English learners. Like, that was my favorite thing to do. Like, my claim to fame in my elementary school is that 90% of our kids left 3rd grade on grade level. So, like, how can it all be wrong now? But then the more I learned about it, the more I learned that a lot of what we did with Fontes and Pinnell, a lot of what we did with other programs and other structures in the past still contained those 5 pillars. They were just packaged a little differently, and the research still spoke about them, but wasn't as publicized, I guess. So I would say you're doing the same things if you're doing other types of programs that don't say, gung-ho science of reading. I bet you can find phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary comprehension work in there, right? A well-rounded approach. So thinking about what you're doing now, whether you're the content teacher or you're the ESL teacher, right? Why is that push in program working a little bit better in the upper grades than that pull out program is working? I'm not saying 100%. You may have like the best kick butt program of pull out ever. Not saying that's not possible, but the generalities here. How can we, like, what's happening that creates that difference? And then what can we do complementing each other, supplementing each other, and not supplanting each other, right? That's a federal grant rule. Supplement, not supplant. Make sure I get that straight, right? Where you're told, like, when you're spending federal grant money, it has to be spent on things that will supplement the experiences of students, right? You can't spend it on something that is just replacing something else. So I can't just say, here, English language development teacher, you take them and do the language arts block. Then they still have one approach. It's just maybe a little different approach, but they have one approach, and they're not getting the expertise of their original content teacher. And so we don't want to do that, pass the buck. We don't want to pass them on. We want to add on. So what does each person bring to the table, and how can we keep that relationship of respect where everyone is bringing something to the table for our students to have all the pieces? All right, so here's some things that came to mind for me as I really started to think of, that 1.5 times is just really stuck in my mind. How can I help schools and teachers build toward that, right? I don't know that we'll ever get 1.5 times, but we can definitely find times, right? So in our pull out, what can we do to make our pull out line go up? In content-based ESL, what can we do? I mean, beyond bilingual, not everybody can be in bilingual, doesn't have that opportunity. So how can we make the other programs fit? And the first key that I'm going to say is I am not saying this is the entire 1.5 times faster is the responsibility of the English language development teacher. I hope it was really clear in there that I said it is the responsibility of all the adults involved to supplement each other and find ways to make the most of everybody's expertise, right? So what that means is that, like, this chart to me was saying that students are outgrowing their native language capacity without a bilingual program. We know students who have strong educational background, literacy backgrounds in their first language will transition that into English more quickly and more easily, right? That's long-standing research. The benefits of your first language development are a huge support for your second language development. Well, when we're starting students so early, if we are not maintaining and growing their first language, we're pulling a support out from under them. So not everybody can have a bilingual program, but what can we do to encourage families and students to continue to develop their first language? If they develop CALP, academic language, in their first language, then we can transfer that over into English. But if we're taking students in kindergarten and stopping their first language development, then they have academic language and nothing, and we start from scratch. So without a bilingual program, what can we do to continue to develop that first language as a support? When it comes to middle school and high school schedules, we often only allow for one class period of English language development instruction. And some places, not even that, right? Because it's hard to schedule. It's very hard to schedule. So one period a day, our students are really focused on that oral language development, the comprehension, the communication part, that oral language piece, that's the foundation. And then the other hours of the day, they are trying to catch up. So there's a disconnect there. We can't do 1.5 times for one period a day, right? Which leads me to the next piece, which is a combination of things. In my mind, our pullout starts to lose some effectiveness when our students get to the age where there's a lot of specialized vocabulary and content, right? I can't be an expert in the academic language demand for all the different content areas at all the different grade levels, because it's been a long time since I took chemistry, right? So as the ELD person, I don't have the expertise to continue to pour that into my students beyond a certain point, and to be able to keep up with all the different teachers and all the different academic language is enough to make your head spin. So then on the other hand, we have our content teachers who have that expertise. They know the academic language. If we do a little bit of coaching, they'll know how to find what language students need to be successful in their content area. But again, they're lacking the training or the expertise or the confidence in doing that language development within their content area, or they're not sure how it fits together so that it's not something extra, right? So we have, where the children are spending the majority of the day, how can we beef up that language exposure during all parts of their day, right? And so we need to work with our content teachers on getting their confidence up. And I do think that's part of why a push-in type program is ranking a little bit higher, because there's that embedded staff development. If I'm coming into algebra, then the algebra teacher is just naturally going to pick up on some of the pieces that I bring to the room. And we want that to happen. Co-teaching is the best professional development, two-way professional development, right? I'm learning more about the academic language demand in your classroom. You're learning more about how to bring academic language more into focus in your classroom. So I think that is part of why it's a little bit higher. A big piece that I think is missing in our classrooms is that oral language development, focused on academic language. Our kids talk all the time, no doubt about it. They're getting lots of oral language time. But how do we maximize those opportunities for our students to be using academic language? All right, what are we setting up in our classrooms? And this is really how the English language development teacher and the content teacher can get together and say, we need time for student-to-student discussion with this vocabulary and these concepts. What can that look like? What supports do we need to do first? How should we model it first? Right, one tip I always give teachers is, as the teacher, I'm going to model it twice. If I'm using a sentence frame, or I'm saying, I know that fraction A is greater than fraction B because, right, if I'm modeling how to speak with academic language, I model twice, give two examples. I ask two different students to model. And then if I feel like we're ready, then go student to student, right? We never jump straight to student without modeling and some structure first. So this is where we can bring our skills together and get more make more of those hours they're exposed to English, we can just pack as much goodness into those hours as we can. All right. What other things, what does this mean for instruction? Right. In our early grades, they are already focused on oral language development, but how can we continue to make that even richer? Right. Just that is the foundation for literacy. We did some informal research in the last school district where I worked, where we looked at the scores when we did the kindergarten screening for students entering kindergarten to see if they qualified for the English language development program. Students who were in pre-K programs scored significantly higher on the screening assessment than students who weren't. I mean, it makes sense. It's the hours in English, right? How many hours they exposed. So how can we just keep multiplying the amount of time students are engaged in English in all of our classrooms? And just really honor how important that K-2 time is when it comes to that oral language development. Yes, we need all the pillars of science of reading. We need the phonics, we need the fluency, we need all of these things, but we can't forget that oral language development and background knowledge side. We have to have things to talk about, and we have to talk a lot about them. So how can we get a better balance so that we can get our students to close that gap sooner than later? Then in our instruction, as the ELD teacher and as the content teacher, we really have to think about the language that we're teaching, right? No more wait till they have their social language down before we dive in, right? I'm just going to go to my retirement home with that as my soapbox to stand on, right? They can do it. Get them into it. They love to sound smart. They can get into academic language from the beginning. Maximizing oral language development beyond third grade. When we get past the early grades, we tend to do a lot more talking to students instead of letting students talk to each other. It becomes a management thing. There's lots of strategies that you can use to help with the management and lots of strategies for making meaning and bringing, remember we said in that one slide where there has to be meaning and context, right? How are we bringing that? We need phonics instruction, but CVC nonsense words have zero meaning, and it's really hard for a multilingual student to attach that to their memory because they need meaning, right? We need to find that meaning. I love that you're sharing strategies. So I think one thing that I will do is share the chat box comments with everyone when I share the replay, because there's a lot of great sharing going on. Thank you so much for that. And I know I'm running a bit behind. I got excited about this. So one approach that I have learned through my career that I always knew worked, and one of the reasons I panicked with all of science of reading is I'm like, are they telling me that this isn't, like, I know it works, why shouldn't we do it? And then as more work came out, we're like, yes, like those last two pieces matter. So just something to consider. We've had a lot of success over the years with keeping with our traditional teaching in our classrooms, but either adding into into math, into science, into social studies, into the English language development block, teaching those skills from right to left. And what I mean by that is just this graphic, right? Look at the right side of the graphic. Can we start with oral language development and background knowledge? Get some comprehension going, get the vocabulary going, right? Great, rich conversations in meaningful topics, build up our oral language fluency, and then learn what those pieces are that make up the language that we're using. If one of us is teaching left to right and one of us is teaching right to left, we're going to find beauty in there, right? So what does that look like? I have to put in a plug. I'm sorry to make it a little bit of a sales pitch, but we have our active learning for early literacy for newcomers, and our we have a whole to part course and a whole to part in-person workshop. Right? We go deep into different ways that we can do this more right to left. We call it whole to part. But when I saw that graphic, I was like, yes, this is the whole, and these are the parts, right? And so what that looks like in the classroom is what I said, like think of the pillars, and one teacher's coming this way and one teacher's coming this way, right? So we start in the classroom with oral language development. We're picking a topic, we're talking about it, you align those topics with what's going on in the content classroom, perfect, right? That's content-based ESL, right? We are talking about these topics. We are brainstorming. We're getting background knowledge going. Let's say we're talking about ecosystems in class. We're going to do literacy development during science. It doesn't all have to happen in the ELA block. Say it's science, talking about ecosystems. We do the vocabulary, talk about the different biomes, get excited about the animals, talk about, what makes different places more livable than others for different animals, get them all into it. Then we are going to start adding in our literacy, right? Let's do some collaborative writing or some co-created text. Let's start writing about all these ideas you've been sharing verbally. They know what they want to say. They have the words. Now let's put it in writing. And then we keep reading what we're writing. We're reading our own words. We're reading at a higher level because we have meaning, right? So we do the oral language development. We write with their ideas that they have developed with their words. And then we're reading their words. And then we can take a leap off to read something not written by them, because then they have the language, have the vocabulary, have some of the literacy skills. And then I can break that down into different foundational skills. I can always point out those initial sounds, or we can go back and look at what we wrote about biomes, and we can look for patterns, word patterns, vowel patterns, initial sounds, blends, whatever it is we're studying in language arts. We can go back and look at our science writing for the same information, right? So thinking about how to come at it from both directions. Where in your day can you get them super excited about speaking, and then build that into some writing and reading, and then break that down into the little skills? We do lots of modeling of that in our courses, and probably in a future webinar, we'll get more into the details of it. But I really think that understanding of the different roles and why they matter so much, and why we really need to start focusing on complementing each other and teaching each other so that we can maximize the time that we have with students, right? We have, according to Dr. Ortiz, 28,000 hours. Like, we have to put 1.5 times the language into the 28,000 hours we have. We can do that. We can't make 1.5 times more hours, but we can put 1.5 times more language development into those hours. All right, I know I have been talking quickly and running through everything, so I will share the recording of what we talked about tonight. I will share the ideas from the chat box, unless if you have an objection, let me know. I can erase. I don't think anybody made any inappropriate comments, but you guys shared lots of good things that I want to go back and read too. And then there will be a little bonus in it for those of you who attended live. So again, if I don't have your full name, make sure you put it in the chat box real quick, or if it's on your login, I'll have it through Zoom. Thank you so much for giving up an hour plus of your time this evening. If you have any questions or you want to stay for a few minutes, I can stay for a few. And let me know other topics that you want to talk about. Have a good night. We're cruising to the weekend now, so have a good rest of your week.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.